Welcome everyone to our City of Cambridge How to Do Business with the City of Cambridge workshop number 2. My name is Tyrone Bells. I am the small business specialist here with the City of Cambridge Community Development Department. And the second workshop is focused on how do I respond to quotes and bid requests. So there's a lot of great information that we're going to share with you today. We have Liz and Shu from the purchasing department here joining us, which will be helping facilitate this workshop. Please keep in mind that this workshop is a webinar, so everyone is automatically muted because it's a webinar. So if you do have any questions to ask, please put them in the chat or the Q&A section, and I will be monitoring that, and I will let the team here know what questions are coming in through the chat while we are doing this workshop. So please feel free to ask any questions that you might have, and I will definitely be monitoring those so that we can answer your questions. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Liz and Shu to start this workshop.
Thanks, Tyrone. Just to go over things again, I'll reintroduce myself for those who weren't with us last week. I'm Liz Unger, and I'm the purchasing agent for the City of Cambridge. And I'll turn it over to Shu so he can introduce himself as well.
Hello, my name is Shu Wang. I'm the assistant purchasing agent for goods and services. Happy to join everyone here.
So thank you. And as Tyrone mentioned, that this particular workshop is going to be focused on responding to requests for quotes and invitation for bids. So tonight's agenda, I want to give everyone just a brief recap of what we talked about last week. And essentially that was that focus around sound business practices and what does that mean for the city. And then we're going to move into what is a request for quotes and what is an invitation for bids. And finally, we're going to end it up with our attempt to demystify the city contract documents and the requirements and all of the paperwork that one sees accompanying a request for quotes or an invitation for bids from the city. So for that sound business practices piece, if you recall, last week we talked about how does the city go about purchasing items or services that are going to cost less than $10,000. And the statute requires we follow what is sound business practices, which means for the most part, the city can reach out to someone and just say, how much is it for 100 widgets? I need 100 widgets. How much is it going to cost? And it's around, say, $1,500. The city can say, well, okay, will you accept a purchase order? I think that's a good price. And yes, you'll accept a purchase order. So the city will say, send me that quote in writing and I'll get a purchase order issued to you. And then the department will order the widgets from you. And it's really essentially a non-competitive process that the city goes through. Periodically, the city does have to do some price quotations or search websites or catalogs or other areas for pricing just to make sure that the city's getting a reasonably good price when it's operating under that $10,000 threshold. So that's essentially the groundwork that we began last week. Next slide, please, Shu. So now, today, what we're going to do is take what we learned last week. Okay, we're under $10,000. That's all well and good. But what happens when the city is seeking a good or service that is going to cost $10,000 or more, but not more than $50,000? What the law says we have to do as the city to procure those items or services now is to solicit written quotes from at least 3 vendors who customarily provide that particular supply or service that we're seeking. So essentially, what that means is we have to reach out to at least 3 vendors. But we can reach out to more vendors if the city is aware of more vendors who do supply that service or that good and are willing to do business with the city. We have to provide each vendor with a written description of the supply or service that's needed so that all vendors are on an equal playing field and know for what the city is asking, right? So if it's 1,500 widgets, if widgets happen to have a specific size, then we need to specify what that size is. If widgets are made out of different types of materials, we would have to specify in that request for quote what material the widgets must be made out of, etc., and send that to at least 3 vendors. The vendors can then submit their quote to the city, but in order for the city to act on that quote from the vendor must be in writing. And then the city will award the contract to the vendor that offers the quality and quantity of the supply or the service at the lowest price. So the request for quote process does focus on pricing. And now that the city has shifted to its e-procurement system, the city will request quotes using that e-procurement system. And so that's a great reason for vendors to become registered in the system. You have to be registered in order to respond to a request for quote. However, if the city is aware of your business and has your email or contact information, you don't need to be registered already in order for the city to send you a notice that we're requesting quotes. But it still would be more efficient if you want to be automatically notified of certain opportunities if you are registered within the e-procurement system already. And one thing to note, we get caught up on this a lot, sometimes in purchasing, but we don't need to receive at least 3 quotes and then compare them on prices. We only have to ask at least 3 vendors for quotes, but you may be the only vendor who responds, and we could still move forward and award a contract to you if you are providing the quantity and quality of the supply or service that we were seeking. So that's just like a little footnote. Next slide, please, Shu. So what's in a request for quote, right? It's really because of that need to receive responses in writing from the vendors in order to act on them, we use a formal document that includes that written description of the supplier service that I mentioned on the last slide, and lists out other requirements as well that the vendor must meet in order to be awarded the contract. Again, we will send this document to at least 3 vendors, and now we do use the e-procurement system in order to do that. And I sort of italicized respond here on this slide to show that we can still reach out to you if we have your contact info, even if you haven't registered already in the system. However, in order for you to then respond to that notice, you will have to be registered in the e-procurement system. The RFQ is also going to include other forms, some of which the vendors must sign and submit back along with their quote. And it will also include notices that are important, notices about legal requirements, for instance, that the vendor has to be aware exist, but that don't need to be signed by the vendor or returned to us. And we're going to go over these forms together with you tonight, at least mention them and call them out to you so that you know what they are and you're not sort of taken aback by the amount of paperwork or forms that are involved in this. And the city also will include what is a sample contract that the city would be executing with the vendor if that vendor is awarded the contract. The city calls this contract the Articles of Agreement. And there'll be a sample that's part of the RFQ package so that the vendors know what they need to be willing to sign if they're awarded the contract with the city. And I think, Shu, the next slide is yours.
So I wanted to take a moment to kind of give an example and a sample so people know what the document looks like and what to look out for. If any vendor receives an invitation for a request for quote, or if you go to our website and go into the public portal and click on any of the publicly available invitation for bids, what you're likely to see is a page very similar to this. There's a bunch of tabs, the brief description of the project up there, as well as a few key dates immediately on the welcome page of that project. I want to point out specifically that this page is pretty important for anybody seeking to respond to this. You'll see the release date of the project for anything that's public or for anything that's private, that's sent directly to folks to request quotes. That's when the project became live, essentially. The question submission date, every project or nearly every project will have a deadline by which we are accepting questions. These could be questions related to the project itself, maybe some background questions relating to the history of the project, or even questions about details of the specifications that we may not have anticipated prior to putting it out. I do want to point out that because we have to respond to all of those questions in writing and in a public manner, we set this deadline so that everyone can submit those questions in writing prior to that deadline. And so that's an important date to keep in mind whenever someone's thinking about responding to one of these projects, but there's something that's not quite clear to them. That's your opportunity for any vendor to submit questions and to get those addressed prior to submitting something. And lastly, of course, there is the project deadline date, because everything is public and is submitted at the same time. This is kind of the drop dead deadline date by which you have to submit something. And after that date, typically there's we cannot accept anything that is submitted after that date. So these are your key dates on the very front page of the project. Following that, there's usually a project documents tab, which has a bunch of tabs to the right. And I wanted to highlight three of these sections that are going to be present in every single project that the city puts out, as well as any project that you're likely to see from other cities, towns, even the state. The scope of work and services section is kind of self-explanatory. It details the details of the project, what is expected, the deliverables that are to be due, the anticipated timeline if there is one, and any very technical detailed specifications that may be part of the project, so you can get a description of what it is that you're expected to do. The pricing proposal, which can come in a table or format, is of course where the vendor is expected to submit their pricing. And this could be on a line item basis, or it can be a lump sum basis, depending on the nature of the project. So it's good to kind of take a look at that and what is included in the pricing that we're asking for from any vendor. And lastly, the submissions section, which includes both usually a bunch of checkboxes for quality requirements. These can be experience of the vendor. These can be quality requirements of the product that they're submitting. It can be references. It can be details of the product that they then submit in like a product sheet format. So this can take a variety of forms and usually includes multiple elements that a vendor is expected to check off and go through in detail to make sure everything is there. And lastly, the attachment section of any of these projects typically include a lot of further documentation that is either for a vendor's review or may be pertinent to the project itself. You'll see that for this project that I'm using as an example, there's a bunch of ordinances and policies that are part of most of the city's standard contracts. These are the city ordinances that apply to most of our typical contracts on a daily basis. But you may also find other documents as part of this page, including maybe maps or drawings of a specific building or plot of land that the project is to take place in, or even detailed product specifications that may not be part of the scope itself, but included here as like an Excel table or a PDF or even other tables that you're expected to fill out. So always good to check this attachment section for anything else that is pertinent. Usually anything that's required to be filled out here is usually called out as well in the scope of services. So there's no, so everything is clear, and that so that everyone will be able to see both sections of it. And then lastly, we always include the sample documents, as Liz mentioned earlier, down here at the bottom. And this is kind of our standard template contract documents. It will typically be the same for most projects, but whenever there's a difference, it's good to take a look at the sample documents, the sample contract as well.
So want to talk a little bit about quality requirements, because you've heard us, throw those two words around now a few times in the few minutes that we've been together. So essentially the quality requirements that'll be listed in each quote process or invitation for bid process are basically the minimum standards that the vendor must meet in order to win the contract. And really it's the vendor and or the vendor's product that's really got the quality requirements attached to it. Essentially, the quality requirements, they set the expectations that the city has. For instance, the vendor's experience. The city could say, we need somebody who is experienced in, doing this particular type of field care or landscaping work, and dealing with this type of trees, for instance. Or we can measure the experience in years in the type of experience that it may be. We could measure it by requiring a certain number of successful projects that have been completed. So, someone may have 10 years of experience in a particular field of work, but really how much work have they done? How many successful projects have they done in that particular period of time? We could measure that by saying you need at least 5 successful projects within the past 5 years, for instance. Or there could be other relevant qualifiers like professional licenses or certifications that could be required for a vendor to perform the work. The city could be looking for a particular minimum staff size or capacity of the vendor to respond, especially if it's a service contract and there's various locations spread throughout the city. There could be a minimum requirement for a particular size of staff. There could be a very specific project or delivery schedule that the vendor has to commit to. Oftentimes the city's delivery schedule can be loose, and say, we need X sometime this month delivered. But there are other times where the performance schedule is really central to the success of a project. And so the vendor may need to say, I have these items in stock and I can deliver them to you by, yes, this deadline that you put. So that can be another quality requirement that you might see. There can be any other number of factors that a department may need or consider important for a particular procurement. So you want to look at the quality requirements. And make sure that you can actually say yes to each of those. And then I put this little note in italics. Later on, one of the things Shu had mentioned about is also the bid submission requirements and certain things that need to be submitted along with your quote or bid. And oftentimes the city will ask for references. Keep an eye on the type of references that are specified in that. Sometimes it just may say 3 references. Sometimes it may say at least one of them must be another municipality, for instance, of the same size and demographics of the city of Cambridge. Regardless of the requirements, follow those requirements. But if they're not called out beyond give us 3 references, be sure to include the references that you provide in this response to be references that can support that your company meets certain quality requirements that were called out. So if the city required you to have 2 successful projects, for instance, doing a particular thing, and then it asks you for 3 different references, provide references that can speak to those successful projects. And that's a way for you to kind of more efficiently provide that upfront documentation or certification that you meet the quality requirements. So I think that's a key player. Sometimes vendors submit references that can't speak to the work that the city has gone out to request a quote for. And so that can be a little bit daunting and make it more difficult to award the contract. Next slide, please, Shu. So a rule for award, another thing that you will see as part of this process, whether it's a request for quotes or an invitation for bid, is what we call the rule for award. And the rule for award lets the vendor know how the city will determine which vendor is getting the contract. And again, we talked about lowest price. If it's a responsive and responsible vendor offering what the city is seeking, then it's driven by price. But sometimes it's not clear how the city will determine who's the responsive and responsible vendor that's offering the lowest price. Sometimes the city will break up commodities. For instance, say we're buying furniture and bookcases, desks and bookcases, just as way of example. We may say that we're in, and it'll be in the rule for award, that we're categorizing desks separately. We want a total cost for desks. We're categorizing bookcases separately. We want a total cost for that. And the rule may say that the city may award multiple contracts per item category to the lowest vendors offering those particular categories. So we could be in a situation where it's not based on the grand total, but that the city's going into that price and breaking up those components even more. But that has to be told to you up front in the rule for award. And essentially, the rule for award is designed to help ensure a fair, open, and transparent process so that there's no questioning later, well, my grand total was less, but yeah, the desks you could get cheaper from X vendor, and my bookcases were much cheaper. So it just keeps everybody on that level playing field, or at least an open, transparent process. And on the bottom here, we have what a sample rule for award could look like. And I think this sample actually was taken from the sample that we used in the procurement system that Shu was displaying to you earlier for the locks and hardware. That was the rule for award. Next slide, Shu, and I'll turn it back to you.
Sure, and we'll take this moment to just give a few examples of the price sheets or the price proposal sections of most of these solicitations, because this is honestly where I think we see the most problems come up when vendors are submitting their proposals and bids and quotes. A simple request for quote documentation may have something similar to this. This is a very simple kind of price sheet request. You can see that we're just looking for some paper. It specifies the number of reams, the type of paper, the specifications here. And so all we're asking for is really a unit price multiplied by the unit total, 500 reams in this case, plus any additional delivery fee so that everything's laid out nicely for a total quote price down at the bottom. You can see this kind of pricing sheet for any kind of singular unit, singular pricing models. This may be, we may seek a lump sum total price for maybe a consultant project that is a set duration of time but doesn't have any individual elements to it. Or like Liz said in her previous example, we may just be buying, 800 chairs or 400 tables or some single purchase like that, in which case there's only a very simple kind of straightforward one-line item pricing request, and it's pretty easy to fill out. Alternatively, more complicated requests for quotes and invitations for bid may have multitudes of line items or multitudes of years. Our contracts are typically 1 year to 3 year terms, and they renew from year to year. So you may see, in fact, multiple years of pricing broken out into multiple tables. The project or the request for quote itself may be single line item award, which means that we're not necessarily awarding to the lump sum total lowest price, but rather each line item has its own award based on the bidder, and people can bid for any number of them. So it's always good to look at that kind of rule for award that Liz had mentioned earlier to see how it is that we're awarding the item specified in the scope itself. How the table is structured should mirror that description laid out in the scope. And if there's anything that is unclear, highly suggest that you put in a question in writing, and then we can address it, clarify it, or fix the table if there is some kind of error that's not quite reflective of what the scope itself is asking for. In this example, you'll see that this is a single contract award still, so similar to the previous example, but there's a ton of different line items with different quantities specified in each. And the unit cost obviously will vary for each one of them. I believe this is for some snowplow parts that is being requested from our department. And then we are still awarding here based on the lowest price for all items here as specified in this section, but this may not be the case for everything that we put out. This could easily be for lowest price for each line item, in which case the single project may have been awarded to 3, maybe 4 different bidders, offering, you know, a variety of elements each.
So I mentioned earlier that we also wanted to talk a little bit about all of the other forms and papers that accompany the city's requests for quotes or invitations for bids. And this includes what is a sample of the articles of agreement. This is what this vendor will be expected to sign and execute with the city, and it covers a lot of important information, especially about the duration of the contract, which is extremely important. Oftentimes, you know, it is not unheard of that both a department and a vendor lose sight of the duration of a contract that they were operating under, and then that really puts everyone in a difficult position once a contract has expired, if that vendor was still providing a service, for instance, to a department. It lays out the payment. It lays out other rules about damages and performance security. Oftentimes, I know it's a little hard to see, but in this Article 9 for performance security, that's if the city requires a performance bond for a goods and services contract. It does happen on occasion, but most of the time, if you look, you'll see that 0% there. So that means that essentially the vendor doesn't have to provide any performance security for this particular contract. So just kind of like, you may see it and get nervous, but then look at what is the percentage that you have to, and when you see that it's 0% that's expected, then you'll know that it doesn't apply in this particular case. Something we added during COVID was the electronic signatures, which allowed us to more efficiently and without having to have vendors come into City Hall, especially when it was closed to the public, come in to deliver their signed contracts. We added this electronic signature, which makes the process a little bit more efficient. We still have that in place today, so we will still accept the contract if you're awarded it until we come up with our implement a DocuSign or Adobe Sign or some other form of digital signature element to this. You will still be able to submit your signed contract back to the city in an electronic format and not have to hand deliver it. Next slide. The forms. We talked about the forms. And again, these can be incredibly daunting. And that's why we have them laid out on the next couple of slides to show you there are forms, and then there are sort of like notices or ordinances that accompany requests for quotes or invitations for bids. We're going to list these forms here together because these forms have to be submitted by the vendor back to the city. And essentially, the first one that's listed is a form that covers 3 or 4 different requirements, one of which is incredibly important, which is the tax compliance / anti-collusion statement. It's also sometimes called a non-collusion statement by folks. The most important thing to know about that form is that the vendor must sign that form and return that form with their quote or their bid submission. The other forms you must also sign and return, and presumably it is best to do it all at once so we don't have to follow up with you. But we can say you didn't sign the query form. Can you make that correction, please, and allow the vendor to correct it? We can say you didn't sign the wage theft confirmation. You have to sign it and check the appropriate boxes. Please do that and get it to us right away. Now, this is happening after the deadline, right? The submission deadline. The same thing for the WISP, which is a relatively new requirement. And then the certificate of authority, we will have to have signed by the vendor in order to execute the contract with them. Why am I rambling about these? It's to bring us back to number 1. Number 1, we cannot follow up with you on it. If you miss number 1 and you don't sign it and you don't submit it with your bid, we cannot follow up and say, could you please send that to us? You forgot to include it. That means we must reject you automatically. It's how the statute is written. And that is when you're submitting, it has to be submitted. Okay.
Liz, we got a couple of questions here.
Sure, Tyrone.
So the first question is, can you explain the wage theft certification? And also the WISP?
So the wage theft, I feel as though it was somewhere back in maybe November-ish of 2016 or so. There was an executive order by the city manager then at that time that required vendors essentially to certify or affirm that wages that were owed to their employees, especially through the cost of performance of this contract, would be paid to those employees. And I think at the time there was a lot of question about some vendors, especially in the service field, not paying their workers appropriately. And so this is a requirement that the vendor must certify to the city that they will not commit wage theft, essentially, and they will be paying their employees appropriately for their work they perform under any contract with the city. And I'm sorry, Tyrone, was there another one besides the wage
Yes,
theft?
number 4, the WISP.
The WISP.
Yes.
Oh, the WISP is actually relatively new, maybe 2 years or 3 years, although since COVID, I have to tell you, I have no idea of timeline anymore in my own mind. But that's the written information security policy, which means essentially if through the course of performance on the contract, the vendor is going to come into contact with any personal identifying information, for instance, for whether they're employees or others, through the performance of that contract, that they have certain protections in place to prevent that information from being stolen or breached from the vendor. And this is something a lot of companies have their own sort of personal information protective policies in place. And this often will result in some questions. This is one that'll be a great for the question period. Is my company, here's my company's WISP or information protection policy. Do I have to sign your WISP form if we have this? And that will give the city the opportunity to address whether the vendor's written information protection policy is close enough and mirrors the industry protections, even though it may not match exactly the wording of the city's WISP. And so that could be waived. And the city would answer that during the question period by saying that this particular policy that's been offered meets the WISP's requirements. So that would be something that you could ask during the question period as well. But essentially, it's an attempt of the city to protect personal identifying information that may come into a vendor's hands throughout the course of their work under contract with the city.
Are those forms coming with the package to bid, or where we can find those forms?
Yes, they'll be included. And I think, Shu, do you mind going back to your slide? I think you had a slide that listed
So
forms,
we'll have,
maybe?
I believe we'll have all of the forms and the policies in either a follow-up email so that everyone can have a copy of them. But for every solicitation we put out, they'll be part of the attachments and part of the submission requirements. So the way it kind of works out is for all of these forms that require signatures, there's actually a digital link that takes you to a copy of the forms where you can kind of go through and digitally sign them all and then submit those. For all of the policies and city ordinances that are applicable. So you'll see the Corey form here and the wage theft certification form here. They all correlate to a city policy that's written out. And those are attachments as part of those solicitations.
Next slide. So as Shu just mentioned, we have the notices which will appear, right? But you don't have to sign these and return these. So essentially, we have the city's Corey policy. You do have a Corey form that you have to fill out and submit to the city, right? These notices just sort of provide the backup and understanding of why you had to sign these other forms in some cases. For instance, you've got the Corey policy. You also will see the living wage ordinance, and many of you may be aware that the city does have a living wage that applies to services contracts with the city. This isn't to be confused with prevailing wage, which applies mostly to construction contracts, but not solely to construction contracts. The prevailing wage law also applies to school bus driving contracts. It applies to moving of existing furniture within a city building, for instance, but not the delivery and setup of new furniture. So that's prevailing wage. This is living wage. It's a city ordinance that the city's had in place for quite some time now. And it sets the minimum that a vendor should be paying their employees to perform a city contract. Okay. And the living wage ordinance generally is updated annually in March, I believe, year to year. And it's only ever increased, I guess is how we'll say that. It's gone up essentially as almost like a cost of living adjustment each year. So that's there. There's nothing for you to sign as a vendor submitting a quote or a bid, but you have to be aware of it because it does apply to the contract. Then there is the truck safety ordinance. This is also relatively new. Back in November of 2020, the city council passed what we refer to as the truck safety ordinance. And that was essentially adopted to set certain safety standards on large vehicles operating within the city on a city contract, okay, to protect vulnerable road users, whether they're pedestrians or bikers or scooter folks. It's puts safety standards on trucks that are being used to perform services for the city or to deliver goods to the city. And then we talked a little bit about the wage theft form that has to be completed by the vendor and submitted back with their quote or bid. And this is just a copy of the executive order that implemented that wage theft requirement. So again, you have to sign it and submit the certificate, but you don't need to further sign the notice that accompanies it. Do you want to pause here, Tyrone, just to see if there's any other questions about the notices versus the forms? I just, I do want to reiterate the big one is under the forms. We need all those forms signed, but essentially the first form, which is the ADA compliance and disbarment statement, but also the tax compliance and anti-collusion, all covered on one form, that has to accompany the bid submission. We can't follow up with you to get that one from you later after the bids have opened, for instance.
Does anyone have any questions about any of the forms or notices that Liz and Shu just talked about? If you do, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. At the moment, we don't have any Liz, but if we do, I'll definitely, actually, yes, we do. Here's one right here.
Hi, Liz. Can you explain a little bit more about the living wages and the prevailing wages, and is the city of Cambridge does tell us which those amounts are or how they go about it?
Yeah. So if we're doing, like I said, a construction contract that's got prevailing wage requirements, or even there are some service contracts, like the bus driving, for instance, that require prevailing wage, the city will include the prevailing wage rate schedule. We'll get that from the state, and we'll include that, especially, if we're going out for a construction project, especially, but if we're doing school bus, for instance, bids, which we do, are currently doing actually, the prevailing wage will be referenced in that bid as well. Now, the living wage, we will tell you what the living wage is. In that, you'll find it in the ordinance, that notice that is there. And in fact, I believe one can kind of look back and see from year to year what that rate was. So you will go like to the bottom to the most current rate and know that that's what is expected. But again, with the understanding that from year to year, usually around March, you'll see an increase to that. And the city will post that also on the city's website itself whenever they change the living wage ordinance. So you can always look there. And you can always, if for some reason you need to know what it is, but say you're not even necessarily under contract with us, but you just want to know if it's gone up, if you email the purchasing at cambridgema.gov, we're more than happy to send you out the latest living wage ordinance that lists what it is currently.
I believe, just to add on a little bit, I think the living wage itself is updated as well on our website. I think there's actually a line on the purchasing website, though our website is currently undergoing some redesign, so it may be shifting around a little bit, but it should be easily accessible to anyone looking for it. And as for the prevailing wage, like was mentioned, that is set by the state and pertains to essentially all construction projects, as well as a few of the other construction related projects, let's say, construction adjacent. So those are set by the state, and anything that requires prevailing wages to be included will have references to it in the request for quote or invitation for bid documents. It'll specifically call it out, and we'll attach the set of prevailing wages that must be followed to the document as well. So you should have everything altogether in the solicitation.
I think one of the things maybe also to sort of call out is, you notice last week when we were doing sound business practices, we weren't really talking about any of these forms for the most part. And that is essentially like, for instance, living wage ordinance, the truck safety ordinance, those attach to contracts with the city. So when we're operating under sound business practices, for the most part, generally speaking, we don't have a contract. Sometimes we will have a contract with a vendor to lay out, especially if it's a particular service, we'll lay out what are the tasks, what are you going to do this week, what's the next week, etc. And we'll have something to document that in writing, but it essentially doesn't automatically get all the other contract requirements attached to it. So this is what's happening now when you've hit that $10,000 mark with the city and you're executing. A few slides back, we showed you the articles of agreement. So you need those articles of agreement, plus you have to be at that $10,000 mark or higher to have these requirements sort of attach to what we're doing. I guess next slide, please, Shu. So tonight is about requests for quotes and invitation for bids. So what is an invitation for bids? So invitation for bids is a method that the city often uses to procure supplies and services that are estimated to cost more than $50,000. But when I introduced a request for quotes to you, there was this little thing, italics there, that said essentially the city can do an invitation for bid when it's operating in the request for quote dollar threshold. So we can do an invitation for bid even if we're at $10,000. You know, we could do quotes from 10 to 50 and bids over 50, but sometimes we will conduct an invitation for bid process when we expect the estimated value to be only $20,000 for a contract. And why is that? Well, essentially, an invitation for bids is like a request for quotes on steroids, right? So what we're doing here is trying to really cast a wide net to capture as many vendors as possible that we think could be out there and would see notice of it. So generally speaking, an invitation for bid will have all of the requirements that we just walked through on the RFQs. All of those will apply to the invitation for bid process. But the invitation for bid has some additional requirements. And those requirements come back, really, they're the city's responsibility to ensure an open, fair, transparent process. The invitation for bid, or IFB, requires public notice. So remember, the RFQ, we could solicit quotes from at least 3 vendors. So we either look into the new e-procurement system, or obviously we're already aware of vendors who do a particular service. We have to send out that request for quotes to at least 3 of them. Sometimes we send it out to more. However, the invitation for bid is not just send this to 3 of whom you're aware. This is make a public notice out there so that any vendor who provides that good or that service has an opportunity to see it if they're looking in these particular areas. And this is why it's good to call this out to all of you, because these are places that you can go from week to week to see if the city has advertised bids for goods or services, and construction advertisement as well, although there's a slight difference on the last bullet if it's construction. So the city has to provide public notice on the city's website. So as Shu had alluded, you can go to the purchasing website and you can see what opportunities are there. You're now going to be guided to register for the e-procurement portal when you do that. But we also have to advertise in a newspaper of general circulation that serves Cambridge. currently that's the Cambridge Chronicle. So if you guys get the Cambridge Chronicle, you want to look at that, you'll see in the legal notices, City of Cambridge bid opportunities listed there. We must also advertise on Combis, and Combis is the state's website, procurement website. And I think Shu and I, when we'll ask Tyrone to make that link part of what he sends out to everyone afterwards. So Tyrone, we'll give you that link that can be sent to participants here tonight so that they can look up on Combis, because they may find other opportunities for themselves there as well. If the estimated value of the contract is going to be $100,000, well, more than $100,000, the city must also place the ad in what's called the Goods and Services Bulletin, and that is a publication that the Secretary of State publishes. And I believe vendors can have a subscription to that bulletin if they want. Construction projects are also advertised in the Secretary of State's publication, but it's a different publication. It's called the Central Register. So we have to put this notice out there in the world, right? So we'll advertise in the Chronicle. We'll advertise on our website, Combis, and if the price requires it, the Secretary of the State's publications. But they have to be available and published at least 2 weeks before the bids are due. So that will give vendors at least 2-week period to get their bid together. Presumably, you know, it's a higher dollar value, so there may be more number crunching involved or information that the vendor has to pull together more than they would need for a request for quote process. And so they have that minimum 2-week time that the bid is publicly available. During that, for many of our bids, there will be a question period, just like there was in the quote period. So, you know, we would certainly urge anyone who has a question about a bid to submit that question through the portal during the question period. Another thing that we will do is, if we know of vendors, they may not be registered in the new e-procurement system yet necessarily, but we have their contact information. If we know that vendors' contact information, we know that this is a particular commodity or service they provide, once the bid has been advertised, then the city may also send an email notice to those vendors saying, hey, have you seen this opportunity to bid with the City of Cambridge? But again, we can't do that before it is publicly available, because that would be giving a known vendor like a leg up on the process. So everyone should find out, it should become public for everyone simultaneously. And then we can also send an email sort of poke to people saying, have you seen this bid opportunity? So that's another reason, again, to be registered with the city.
And then we have a question.
Just as a
Sure.
question, what do you recommend if you are looking at the Combis versus your website? Will they both have the same services requested, the same, I guess, questions? What will you have in both places for the same projects?
So what we'll have on Combis is just the advertisement saying,
Okay.
such and such, you know, we need locks and hardware, see this particular bid, right? And then you would still go to the city's e-procurement portal to access all of those documents that you would need to respond. Did I answer?
Yeah, I think so. I'm just curious because I'm a little bit more familiar with Combis, and I'm just wondering, what do you suggest looking for the solicitation for work through Combis or through the website?
Well, if you're interested in Cambridge specifically and solely, I would say go to Cambridge's site.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think it'll be more specific to us, right? Rather than you having to search combis.
Okay.
And that
Seems like a
combis
relatively-
ad was an addition, actually, that came out in, I want to say 2016, which is like 9 years ago, but seems like yesterday. That wasn't always a requirement for municipalities to advertise on combis, but it became one, and I think it's trying to get more sort of circulation to the combis site as well, so that vendors start to see maybe other opportunities with the state as well. Because combis essentially is run by the state's procurement officer. So the state actually follows and has different requirements than cities and towns do for purchasing goods and services. So I think it was a way of trying to funnel traffic to that area so that vendors could have more of an opportunity to see other opportunities out there.
And I think just to add on to that a little bit, it's good to know that these are all state requirements for advertising minimums for whenever we're bidding things out. So what applies to us also applies to every town, every city nearby. And through our conversations with various vendors, through our vendor fairs, through other public events that we've done, I think a lot of folks didn't know about how to look for these opportunities. Of course, the city website is kind of your primary source if you're looking for any particular job in a city. Combis is a good aggregator because you'll see postings from every town, every city, usually on there. I imagine most of them are pointing back to the original solicitation on their own website. And of course, the goods and services bulletin and whatever newspaper each town and city are using to do their own advertisement and publishing are good ways to kind of just look periodically to see if there's anything of interest in them that may, fit the description of what your firm provides.
And if you are interested in servicing a particular area, it might not be a bad idea to call different towns' purchasing departments just to ask them, in which newspaper do they advertise? Like I said, it has to be a newspaper of general circulation that serves the area, right? So we do Cambridge area, but if you're rolling out further, to Watertown or past Arlington, Lexington, and that can be a sphere of operation for you, just reach out to those towns and ask them where they put their ads. I mean, it doesn't hurt, right? Any way to kind of get more info to empower you guys. Next slide, please, Shu.
Question.
We got a question here, Liz.
Oh, sorry, question. Sorry.
It's more technical, like, is it every, invitation to bid, it has like a kind of bracket on the price that we bid in for, or just in general, will say this is more than $50,000?
In some bids, the city will, sometimes the city will put what they estimate. Certainly on construction, we have to put an estimate of what the estimated value is. But on goods and services, we will occasionally say the city has somewhere around X budgeted for a particular purchase, but we don't often do that. I would say this isn't 100% effective way of doing it, but if you're in the request for quote process, right? If you're responding to a request for quote, then the city is operating under the assumption that that is not going to exceed $50,000 because the city can't award a contract for more than $50,000 using that request for quote process, right? Now, the invitation for bid is one of the ways. Next week, we're going to talk about another way that that's the request for proposals process that the city can use over 50,000. But the IFB is one way the city can procure legally contracts that are going to cost greater than 50K. But if you remember a little bit earlier on, I had mentioned the statute also allows the city, instead of doing an RFQ and sending it out to 3, it says the city could conduct an invitation for bid instead, which is really, again, that RFQ that's super advertised to everyone, right? And it has to be out there for a minimum of 2 weeks, etc. So it isn't as always 100% to say, I'm responding to an IFB, so I know I can be over 50,000 in my cost, because that's not necessarily the case. But you can be assured that no contract can be awarded if all the quotes that come in are over 50K. The city just can't award in that case. They could award if, you know, they get only one and it's under 50K. But
yeah.
So now I'll turn this over to Shu, who sees these. Essentially, we do our bid openings on Thursday. The newspaper is printed on Thursday, the Chronicle, the one that the city used. So you see that allows that 2-week roll, you know, to have it appear. And then the 2 weeks later, we can't extend that 2 weeks, but it's a minimum of 2 weeks. You'll see sometimes there'll be addendum posted that postpones the opening to the next week. Sometimes something starts out with a 3-week period in between availability and bid submission deadline. The 2-week, though, is the minimum. So on Thursdays, Shu really is knee deep in what we receive, and so he's going to talk a little bit, and I might interject because I always do. Sorry about some common vendor mistakes in both quotes and bids.
Thank you, Liz. So these are kind of the things that we see most often. Not that it's an exhaustive list, but these are the kind of the common items that come up over and over again and are reasons that we may have to reject bids or proposals or quotes that are submitted to our platforms. The first item is, as I mentioned previously, not quite understanding the price form. Oftentimes, this error comes up when folks are submitting single line items where we're asking for a lump sum total. So there's a table set out. There's kind of the language built in there that says what contract will be awarded on lowest sum total of all items listed. Vendors must submit a pricing for everything. And then, you know, some vendors may just submit a couple of the items on there. Of course, if you total that up, they'll get the lowest, but that's not necessarily what we're asking for. We're looking for perhaps one vendor to submit to perform all of the services in that list. So we're not kind of trying to divvy that up. So always, as a routine kind of standard practice, look at the price form and see what it is that it's asking for, whether it's for single line item awards, whether it's for total awards, whether there's multiple year options in there and we're asking for all 3 years, or maybe it's 1 year with option years to renew. That can make or break a submission as it comes in and as we see it, and we may have to reject before even evaluating the other elements of the submission. Another key item is the committed project schedule. Some amount of the solicitations that we put out are built on a timeline that we are previously committed to, whether it's because of other projects that it overlaps with or because of budgetary constraints within any given year. Any timeline laid out in the project is usually there for a reason. So if you are committing to a project, please just make sure that you are able to perform under that time constraints, because there are some that are under a pretty tight timing constraint due to construction times or due to even for our school departments, you know, based on the school year. We may have language in there that says this is our anticipated timing guidelines, which gives a little bit of flexibility in terms of what the deadlines are for each deliverable or project completion or delivery of product. But those are typically the kind of the timeframes that you should be shooting for anyway. So I guess all I say to that point is please make sure to review the project schedule if it's in there and make sure that you have the capability, the resources, and the products to deliver on that schedule. This third one is a pretty big one. And honestly, probably should have put this first, because this is the primary reason I would say that we've had to reject most of our bids and quotes that are submitted. The quality requirements are part of the solicitation for a reason. They stipulate kind of the minimum requirements that are needed to be able to submit a acceptable quote. Oftentimes you'll see folks submitting a quote even though they don't meet specific requirements. This may be like compatibility issues with what their product is offering with existing product that we have laid out, or we may even put, you know, a timeline restriction in there, must be able to provide the services prior to this date, and they check no. When there is a no on a quality requirement, this is another one of those points where when we see that, that's almost an automatic rejection of the bid or the proposal. And we don't even get to the next stage of kind of evaluating the references, all the other elements of it. So please pay extra attention to any of the quality requirements listed in. They're kind of just the minimum required for that bid or that quote. References. So this element can be, I guess, addressed in a few different ways. Some submissions don't have the required 3 references. That's our typical standard reference requirement. For certain projects, we may require more. For certain projects, there may be less. But for, I would say, 95+% of our bids and quotes, there's kind of the standard 3 references for other projects that you've done, or 3 references for people who you've done the project with. Please make sure that those references can confirm the quality requirements that are laid out in the project. So those references should be able to speak to, you know, your previous job performance as it pertains to the project itself. So look at the scope for the elements that you want to address, as well as address the quality requirements, because that when our departments, when we reach out to those references for those checks, those are the key guidelines that we're going to be reaching out for. If you've done work with the city before, we have language in the reference requirements that allows us to use ourselves as a reference as well. But you can use the 3 reference requirement typically to give us additional sources of input on your past work project. And I think it goes without saying that make sure your references are going to be good references. You'd be surprised at how many times folks have submitted references that have reported badly on their projects. And so we tend to reject those as well for those reasons. And then lastly, and I'll stress this again, please make sure if you have any concerns, any questions for any project, just submit those questions during the questions period. Because all of these projects tend to be either public or private, but to a select number of vendors, we have to respond to all of these questions and concerns in a public manner. And with the questions period, once that question period passes, we are actually not able to accept any further questions. A lot of times we've seen vendors submit proposals, even though they didn't quite understand something in the project itself, and then try to correct it after the fact or submit addendums to the bid or the quote. And that's another reason for rejection. We just cannot accept any changes to the specifications after the project has passed, after the project has closed and opened. So take a look at that questions period. If there's anything of concern, anything of that is unclear, make sure to submit those in writing. We'll address those, get those to posted in a public manner, in an addendum or in the Q&A section of that project, so that everybody has kind of an equitable way to view and to review it and be able to present their bid and with enough time to gather all the information. I don't know if Liz has anything else she wants to add to all of these.
Yeah, I think one of the things I do want to add, I think we talked about it a little bit last week again as well, but again, to the first bullet about the price form, really understand the price form, and you'll likely see language in there that will say something like the price must include the entire cost for providing the supply or the service to the city of Cambridge. So oftentimes, like, vendors will make a mistake. They'll bid on something, they'll have a contract executed, and then when they invoice the appropriate department, they've tacked on a delivery fee that they didn't include in their price. But, you know, the contract, the bid document becomes part of the contract as well. And that bid document price sheet specified that the bid amount must include all costs associated with performing that particular contract. So it's not really possible to tack on new charges after the bid is closed and the contract has been executed. So that's something to keep aware of as well, because then you can see how that would skew things and make it unfair. Ultimately, someone else may have been the actual low bidder on that particular project. So that one's a big yes. I would say to the quality requirements, if you feel that you're not sure whether you meet a quality requirement, this is again a great question that can be asked. You know, I have experience doing X for this agency, they're a state agency, you required, you know, the bid document required at least one successful project with a municipality. Will this state agency count to satisfy that requirement? Ask that question. Don't assume. Don't, as Shu said, well, if you choose no, chances are you'll be considered non-responsive, but don't select yes if you don't meet the quality requirement. And the city has had situations where there was a quality requirement that the vendor be licensed by a particular professional industry, and that vendor selected yes. But then when the city, doing its due diligence, checked to see whether that person was certified by this professional group, they weren't. And that became very problematic. Of course, they had to be rejected, and the city does use itself as a reference going forward. So, you know, on future bids, that's a difficult situation. A vendor doesn't want to be in that situation. So be honest. And if unsure, because that's where I think most most folks are not dishonest at all, but sometimes they're mistaken or they're unsure, please take advantage of the question period to ask questions. And if for some reason, if it's a quote and there's a question period isn't called out, ask a question anyway. And if it's substantive, you know, the city will see whether there's time to respond publicly to it. So it doesn't hurt to ask the question. I think that's everything.
Yep, that is the last slide. So any questions?
On
Yep, we have a question coming right now.
the, whether or not, let's say we're, union, will that ever be required, or will they state that in the offer?
The city does not require union.
Okay,
Um,
we are union, so should we put that in the, information? Or does it not matter?
I guess it would depend. If for some reason the city is asking for it, you should provide it, but it isn't generally a requirement, that because under the state law, the way we have to award contracts is to the responsive and responsible vendor that offers the lowest price if we're doing quotes or bids. So there's not a stipulation that someone be a union shop or not a union shop. And it won't guarantee, for instance, we can run into this in certain services contracts. We can't award to a vendor just because they're not a union vendor. If they are responsive and responsible, meet the requirements of the bid, and they come in at the lowest price, then we have to award the contract. Bear in mind, again, that's why we call out some of these notices, that in the very least, there's the living wage ordinance that could apply, or in some instances, as we mentioned, prevailing wage could apply. And so certainly the vendors must conform with those requirements.
Do you have any other questions from the folks online? Didn't seem to be so. So, Liz and Shu, do you have any last thoughts before we wrap up this workshop?
I think, register if you haven't gone to play around and look at our new e-procurement system. I would suggest that. If you have a few minutes to go and take a look at it, that would be a great idea, I think. And I don't know, Shu, do you have anything else?
I think as long as we've made the process a little less scary and convoluted for folks, we will have done something today. We're gonna, I believe, try to get out all of those forms and ordinance information in either an email or a package of some sorts to folks. Tyrone may be able to speak better to that. And I realize I posted the Combis link to private, so not everyone can see it, but I'll post it here again in case people are interested to poke on the state procurement portal to see what available job opportunities there are. But I think the takeaways, it's not, don't be scared, don't be turned away from all of the verbiage, all of the word, all of the documents in it. It is not typically as complicated as you may think it is. And this is kind of the one thing that that folks who are used to doing projects and business with cities may have an advantage over other folks, that they're used to seeing all of these things over and over again and have gotten over that hurdle. And our hope is that this kind of eases folks into it a little bit to get people the opportunity to start doing these things. And hopefully it makes it easier for folks to step into that public sector area.
Yeah, so as Shu just mentioned, I will be emailing the presentation to everybody who attended tonight in person as well as online. Along in that email, I'll also attach the Combis link again, Shu just shared, as well as some of the forums that were chatted about earlier in the presentation. I will have those forms attached as well, so people can get an idea and sense of what those forms are, what they look like, the information that are on those forms. And just a reminder that next Monday at 5 o'clock will be our last workshop, workshop 3, on how to respond to RFPs, requests for proposals. So we hope to see everyone there for that workshop as well. And we thank you for attending in person, online, as well as for Shu and Liz for taking the time to facilitate this workshop.
Great, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
And have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.